The letter in Richmond Palace, the spring of 1603. The corridors of Richmond Palace fell eerily silent. Courtiers crept through shadowed halls, whispering, careful not to disturb the atmosphere of dread that had settled over the royal residence. England's great virgin queen, Elizabeth Tudor, was dead. She had ruled for nearly half a century, defying empires, outmaneuvering assassins, and forging a nation from the chaos left by her father. Yet, in the moments after her passing, the focus of her attendance was not reverence, but fear. Among her belongings lay a documenta, letter whose contents would unnerve even those hardened by decades of Tudor politics. It was written in Elizabeth's own trembling hand. Words scratched across parchment, as though every line had cost her a piece of her failing strength. What those words revealed, if ever truly read, shattered the pristine image of Gloriana, the radiant queen who had defeated the Spanish Armada. It hinted that her death had not been the serene passing of a monarch, but a far darker unraveling. The letter was quickly hidden away, suppressed by order of her successor, James Stuart, but whispers spread nonetheless. Some said Elizabeth confessed to poisoning herself slowly, day after day, with her own cosmetics. Others claimed she hinted at betrayal, that her courtiers, aware of the poisons she used, encouraged her vanity for political gain, ensuring her end came not by dagger or treason, but by powder and paint. This is not the Elizabeth we see in portraits, smooth-skinned, eternally youthful, the Virgin Queen, radiant in white. That was a mask, a creation of politics and deception. The Elizabeth behind the mask was something else entirely, a woman locked in a relentless battle with age, beauty, and survival in a court where femininity itself was both weapon and weakness. Her life was not simply the story of a queen who ruled without a king. It was the story of a child marked by her mother's execution, a survivor in a palace of predators, and a woman who learned that her very face was her kingdom's armor. When smallpox scarred her skin, it was not only her beauty that was lost, it was the illusion of invincibility. And so she turned to artifice. Each stroke of Venetian ceruse across her skin was both restoration and destruction. It's a mask that brought her glory, but also slowly poisoned her body and mind. But this tragedy did not belong solely to Elizabeth. Her struggle embodies the impossible. Expectations placed upon women in power. To rule, she had to appear both ageless and untouchable. To survive, she had to weaponize her femininity without succumbing to it. The line between image and reality blurred until even she seemed unsure which Elizabeth was real, the woman beneath the mask, or the queen it created. By the time of her death, Elizabeth was no longer the commanding monarch who had stared down Philip of Spain or bent Parliament to her will. She had become something more fragile, more human, an aging woman, terrified of her reflection, haunted by ghosts, both real and imagined. A court that once sang her praises now whispered of madness, of sores that would not heal, of trembling hands and sudden rages. And beneath it all, the mask remained thick, alabaster layers of lead-based paint that hid the ruin beneath. Even as it completed her destruction, her final words, it was said, were a request for Maria's last desperate attempt to see the face she had both preserved and destroyed. Whether she wanted reassurance or truth, no one dared grant her wish. The story of Elizabeth's end is not merely about the death of a queen. It is about the death of an illusion. And to understand how she reached that grotesque and tragic conclusion, we must begin at the beginning with a girl born into scandal, whose very existence was forged in blood and betrayal, and who grew up knowing that survival required becoming a master of disguise. Born in blood and scandal, Elizabeth Tudor entered the world on September 7, 1533, a child destined to divide kingdoms. She was the daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, a union so controversial that it had torn England from Rome. Henry had broken with the Pope, abandoned Catholic orthodoxy, and crowned himself head of the Church of England, all to marry Anne and secure a male heir. Instead, he was given a daughter. From the beginning, Elizabeth's existence was a problem. To many in Europe, she was illegitimate, the fruit of a marriage that the Pope refused to recognize. Her birth was marked not by joy, but by disappointment. Even her father, whose obsession with securing a son had reshaped Christendom, greeted her with muted celebration. In a court hungry for stability, Elizabeth was a symbol of fragility. Her fate was sealed 3 years later. In 1536, Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery, incest, and treason charges so grotesque that even her enemies whispered they were invented. Henry, eager to rid himself of a wife who had failed to give him a son, unleashed a campaign of humiliation. Anne was stripped of her titles, her marriage declared null, her name blackened in pamphlets and sermons. For a toddler, Elizabeth, too young to grasp the full weight of the accusations. The message was brutally simple. Her mother had fallen, and her survival was uncertain. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold within the Tower of London. Witnesses noted her composure, her black gown trimmed with ermine, her words of forgiveness for the king who had condemned her. A French swordsman, brought to ensure a swift execution, ended her life with one clean stroke. The crowd gasped. The dynasty had shifted again, and, in that single act, Elizabeth was transformed from princess to bastard, her place in succession erased, her future dependent on the whims of a mercurial father. This trauma would never leave her. Elizabeth grew up knowing her mother had been publicly destroyed, her legitimacy stripped away, her very existence nearly erased from official record. In the cold mathematics of Tudor politics, she was a living reminder of Henry's broken promises and Anne's fall from grace. Even as a child, she must have felt the fragility of her position. Love in the Tudor household was fleeting. Power was everything. Henry's subsequent marriages only reinforced the lesson. Elizabeth watched as stepmother after stepmother entered her life, only to vanish in blood, disgrace, or childbirth. Jane Seymour gave Henry his long-desired son, Edward, but died in the process. Anne of Cleves, discarded after 6 months, was labeled unattractive. Catherine Howard, barely older than Elizabeth herself, was dragged screaming to the block for adultery. To be a wife in Henry's court was to live under a death sentence. Your survival dependent on your ability to please a man whose affections shifted like the wind in this environment. Elizabeth absorbed the harshest truths of power. Before she was old enough to wield it, she learned that love could be a death trap, that beauty was both currency and curse, and that words could kill as surely as swords. The little girl who studied Latin and Greek also studied faces and silences, understanding that in the Tudor court, survival required watching without revealing, listening without speaking. Psychologists today might call it a trauma response. For Elizabeth, it became her defining skill. She learned to smile when she was afraid, to flatter when she was furious, to say much while revealing nothing. It was a mask she would wear all her life, first as a child, clinging to survival, later as a queen, clinging to power, and beneath it all, a darker realization took root. Her own birth had been the catalyst for her mother's destruction. Without Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn might have lived. The weight of that knowledge, whether spoken or not, haunted her. To be a daughter in the Tudor dynasty was to be expendable. To survive, she would need to make herself indispensable. The foundations of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, were laid in these bloody years. The obsession with image, the paranoia about loyalty, the refusal to marry all were born in the shadow of Anne Boleyn's scaffold. Elizabeth had seen too much to believe in love, too much to trust in permanence. She would grow into a woman who mastered deception, not as a choice, but as a necessity. By the time Henry VIII died in 1547, Elizabeth was 13 years old, and already she had learned the most important lesson of all in the Tudor court. Appearances could mean the difference between the crown and the axe. The education of a survivor. Elizabeth's childhood was marked by instability. Out of that chaos emerged one undeniable truth: she was brilliant. From an early age, her tutors marveled at her quick mind and hunger for knowledge. She absorbed Latin and Greek as easily as others learned their prayers. She spoke French with the fluency of a native, mastered Italian, and even dabbled in Spanish. Later, she would write her speeches in elegant, precise prose that echoed Cicero and Seneca, proof of her humanist training. But Elizabeth's education was never purely academic. It was survival training. Every lesson in rhetoric taught her not just how to speak, but how to manipulate, how to say one thing and mean another, how to leave her enemies guessing. Every history text she read showed her the fates of monarchs who ruled unwisely. She saw herself not as a passive student, but as an apprentice to power, learning how to craft an identity strong enough to withstand storms of court intrigue. She had to. Henry's death in 1547 had left England in the hands of her young half-brother, Edward VI, a boy of 9. Elizabeth's place at court was tenuous, technically a princess, but still tainted by her mother's downfall. Yet she managed to carve out a role for herself as a dutiful half-sister, careful never to appear ambitious. Even then, she understood the danger of being seen as a threat. Her first brush with scandal nearly destroyed her. Living in the household of her stepmother, Catherine Parr, Elizabeth became the object of troubling attention from Thomas Seymour, Catherine's new husband. Seymour, handsome, reckless, and ambitious, took to visiting Elizabeth in her chambers at dawn, sometimes tickling her, sometimes engaging in behavior that straddled the line between flirtation and harassment. For a girl of 14, the situation was perilous. Whispers began to spread. Was Elizabeth compromised? Did Seymour intend to marry her and seize the throne through her claim? Catherine Parr intervened, banishing Elizabeth from her household. But the damage was done. Rumors clung to her, feeding suspicions that would follow her for years. Even as a teenager, Elizabeth learned the price of male attention and the necessity of guarding her reputation with ferocious discipline. It is no accident that she later styled herself the Virgin Queen. Chastity was not simply virtue, it was armor. Her greatest test came under the reign of her half-sister, Mary, the first devoutly Catholic. Mary viewed Elizabeth's Protestant, popular, and dangerously charismatic as a rival. In 1554, after a failed Protestant rebellion known as Wyatt's Rebellion, Elizabeth was accused of complicity. Soldiers arrived at her residence at Hatfield to escort her to the Tower of London. It was the same fortress where her mother had awaited execution. Elizabeth entered the tower with measured calm, but she knew her life hung by a thread. For weeks, she languished in her damp, dark chamber, unsure if each day would be her last. When interrogators pressed her, she responded with exquisite cautioning, enough denial to preserve her life, enough ambiguity to avoid perjury. She never cracked. "I am no traitor," she insisted, and the sheer force of her composure saved her. Eventually, Mary released her. But the lesson was etched into Elizabeth's soul. In the Tudor court, survival depended not only on innocence, but on performance. When she emerged, she was not the same young woman who had entered. Her time in the tower forged in her a weapon sharper than any blade: self-control. She would never again allow herself to be cornered, never again offer enemies a single word they could use against her. From then on, Elizabeth became a master of ambiguity, her replies layered, her promises conditional, her smiles concealing more than they revealed. Her education had given her intellect. Her trials had given her armor. By the time Mary I's health began to fail in 1558, Elizabeth was 25 years old. Europe saw her as precarious and unmarried woman, a Protestant in a Catholic world, the daughter of a disgraced queen. But those who had met her knew better. 'Neath her youth and charm lay steel. She had studied survival in the harshest of schools, and now she was ready to turn survival into sovereignty. When the crown was finally placed upon her head, Elizabeth did not weep or falter. She accepted it with the poise of someone who had always known this moment would come. But behind her triumph, shadows lingered. She remembered the tower. She remembered her mother's scaffold. And she understood that her reign would never be secure unless she mastered the greatest disguise of all, the image of a monarch too powerful, untouchable, too eternal, to ever fall. And so began the long performance that would define her reign. The smallpox catastrophe, the autumn of 1562. 4 years into her reign, Elizabeth Tudor faced an enemy that no court intrigue or council could outwit: disease. The queen fell violently ill at Hampton Court, struck by a sudden fever, delirium, and racking chills. Physicians soon identified the dreaded culprit, smallpox. In the 16th century, this diagnosis was often a death sentence. Elizabeth was just 29 years old in the prime of her reign, yet her attendants began to prepare for the worst. The court dissolved into chaos. Who would succeed her? She had no husband, no children, no heir. For days, England teetered on the brink of civil war, as factions positioned themselves in anticipation of her death. Elizabeth, barely conscious, was said to whisper the names of trusted advisors, begging them to preserve her realm. And then, miraculously, she survived. But survival came at a terrible cost. When she finally rose from her sick bed, the court gasped. Elizabeth's once luminous complexion, long praised by poets, was now marked with the deep, pitted scars of smallpox. One eye had been damaged, leaving it slightly distorted. For a woman whose legitimacy and power had always been questioned, the change was more than cosmetic. It was political. In an age when a monarch's face was a symbol of their authority, Elizabeth's scars threatened to unravel her carefully cultivated image of strength and youth. She never forgot the humiliation. Courtiers whispered about her altered appearance. Ambassadors recorded her decline in dispatches. Elizabeth, who had grown up knowing her survival depended on perception, was now confronted with a cruel truth. Her body had betrayed her. From this moment forward, she embraced the mask. She turned to the cosmetics of the age, specifically Venetian ceros, a deadly white paste made from vinegar and lead. Applied thickly across her face and neck, it concealed the scars and created the illusion of porcelain smoothness. To her courtiers and subjects, she seemed ageless, untouched by disease. But the mask came at a terrible price. The lead seeped into her skin, poisoning her slowly, causing hair loss, tooth decay, and festering sores that demanded even more pain to hide. What began as necessity hardened into obsession. The queen, who once embodied vitality, became enslaved to her own reflection. Painters were forbidden to depict her with wrinkles or flaws. Courtiers knew better than to speak of her age or ill health. The mask of youth was not simply vanity, it was propaganda. Elizabeth understood that to appear eternal was to keep her kingdom secure. But each time she painted her face, she was also ensuring her own destruction. And yet, the irony is cruel. For while the mask preserved her throne, it eroded her humanity. Beneath the alabaster paint, Elizabeth's skin blackened. The sores deepened, her teeth rotted, her hair thinned. She must have known the truth that she was slowly poisoning herself, but by then the mask had become inseparable from her reign. To remove it would be to admit weakness. The Virgin Queen was no longer just a monarch. She was a performance, a living icon, a mask made flesh, In this duality, the radiant Gloriana, adored by her people, and the decaying woman beneath would only grow sharper as the decades wore on. But before she became the haunted figure of her final years, Elizabeth would rise to the height of her power. The mask of youth, though deadly, allowed her to command loyalty, inspire devotion, and outwit her enemies. It would carry her through her greatest triumph, the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Gloriana and the Armada. By the 1580s, Elizabeth had ruled England for more than 2 decades. She was no longer the uncertain young woman who had survived smallpox and imprisonment, but a seasoned monarch, revered and feared in equal measure. Yet, the same forces that had threatened her from the beginning, her legitimacy, her gender, her lack of an heir, still haunted her reign. To hold her throne, Elizabeth needed not just authority, but myth. And so, Gloriana was born. The poets and painters of her court recast Elizabeth not as a mortal queen, but as something closer to a goddess. In their verses, she was Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice, returned to earth. She was Cynthia, the chaste moon, presiding over a nation of men. She was Gloriana, the radiant embodiment of England's destiny. The mask of youth that Elizabeth had adopted after smallpox now fused with this mythology. The queen who never aged, never wed, never yielded. Her image became a form of power greater than armies. Portraits were tightly controlled, their symbolism deliberate. Jewels, pearls, suns, moonsaw, signifiers of eternal purity and divine authority, framed her painted face. No artist dared show her scars or the toll of years. To see Elizabeth was to see perfection, and perfection was political. This myth met its greatest test in 1588, when Spain, the mightiest empire in Europe, unleashed its armada against England. Philip II, once Elizabeth's suitor, now sought to unseat her and restore Catholic rule. The threat was existential. Elizabeth could have remained in the safety of her palaces, but she chose otherwise. At Tilbury, before her assembled troops, she rode out in armor astride a white horse, a vision of martial majesty. Her speech, still famous centuries later, was more than words. It was theater. Carefully crafted to fuse her body with the destiny of her people, she declared, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The effect was electric. Soldiers cheered, morale soared. In that moment, Elizabeth ceased to be merely a woman or a queen. She was England itself, when storms and English fireships scattered the armada. The victory was attributed not just to strategy or weather, but to Gloriana's divine favor. It was the pinnacle of her reign, the triumph of the mask. But triumph carried its own curse. The Gloriana image that had elevated her above mortality also trapped her within it. The Virgin Queen could never marry without shattering her myth. She could never reveal weakness without unraveling decades of propaganda. She had to remain forever youthful, forever radiant, forever untouchable. Even as time advanced, her body decayed, and the mask of lead and paint became thicker, heavier, deadlier. The Armada had secured her crown, but it had also bound her to the performance more tightly than ever. To falter now would be to undo everything she had built. And so, as the 1590s unfolded, the glorious illusion began to fray. Beneath the alabaster mask, Gloriana was dying. The mask consumes the woman the Armada had made Elizabeth a legend. But legends, unlike women, do not age. And therein lay the curse of Gloriana. By the 1590s, Elizabeth was approaching 60, a staggering age in a world where few lived past their 40s. Yet her portraits still showed her as ageless, unblemished, eternal. The reality was far different. Decades of Venetian cerusta, lead-based paste that gave her face its ghostly sheen, had ravaged her body. The poison seeped into her skin, in blood, leaving sores that refused to heal. Her teeth rotted, blackened, and foul-smelling. Her once vibrant red-gold hair thinned to wisps. She resorted to elaborate wigs adorned with jewels and pearls to project vitality. Still, the mask grew thicker. Morning, servants would layer the chalk-white paste over her scarred skin, rouge her lips a violent red, and attach her towering wig. It was armor now, not vanity a shield against the truth that time had won. But the mask demanded sacrifice beyond the physical. Elizabeth became increasingly paranoid. Court, a theater of suspicion. She lashed out at courtiers who dared comment on her appearance, or who arrived at court wearing outfits too splendid, too threatening to her carefully constructed image. She raged at mirrors, ordering some removed from her chambers, as if their reflections might betray her. Her once magnetic charm hardened into cruelty, her wit sharpened into venom. Even those closest to her felt the sting. The execution of her beloved favorite, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, in 1601 revealed the tragic paradox of her reign. Essex had once been her shining courtier, full of reckless bravado, substitute son or perhaps something more for the aging queen. But when he defied her, she could not forgive. To preserve her authority, she ordered his death. Witnesses say she never recovered from the guilt, pacing her chambers, whispering his name, clawing at her painted face as though trying to tear away the mask that had demanded his blood. The virgin queen had become a prisoner of her own invention. In her final years, Elizabeth withdrew further into the illusion. She refused medical treatment, refused to go to bed, sometimes standing for hours, silent and rigid, as though afraid that lying down would mean surrendering to mortality. Courtiers described her as a living ghost. Her painted face, a macabre parody of youth, her body wasting beneath jeweled gowns. She was still a queen, still Gloriana, but a Gloriana hollowed by time and poison. When she finally died in March 1603, she was 69 years old, remarkably long-lived, yet utterly consumed by the performance that had preserved her throne. Those who saw her body noted the terrible toll: the blackened teeth, the balding scalp, the ruined skin hidden beneath layers of white lead. The mask had given her immortality in image, but at the cost of her flesh and soul. And yet, in death, the illusion triumphed once more. Portraits remembered her not as the decaying woman of her final days, but as the radiant Gloriana, forever youthful, forever untouchable. England mourned not the fragile body, but the eternal myth. To Elizabeth Tudor had become what she always feared and desired: a mask that could never be removed. Legacy of the Mask. Elizabeth, I was buried in Westminster Abbey, laid to rest beneath the stones that would later cradle the bones of poets and kings. Yet in truth, she had been buried long before her body gave out. The woman Elizabeth Tudor, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the survivor of the Tower, the clever student with fire in her eyes, had been eclipsed by Gloriana. The eternal mask she wore for her people, and that mask has never slipped. To this day, when we think of Elizabeth I, we do not see the blackened teeth or the lead-poisoned sores. We see the rainbow portraits, the moonlit goddess draped in pearls, the woman who rode in armor before her troops and declared herself both king and queen. The illusion outlived the body, as Elizabeth always intended, but her story is not simply about vanity. It is about the terrible bargains demanded by power. Elizabeth understood better than anyone that survival for a woman on the throne depended not just on strategy and politics, but on performance. She could not age, because to age was to weaken. She could not love, because to love was to yield. She could not be merely human, because humanity was mortal and mortality was dangerous. So she became an idea, good, an icon, a masked, and that is her tragedy. The very illusion that saved her reign consumed her soul. She won immortality, but the cost was loneliness, paranoia, and decay. In her final years, stripped of companions, pacing her chambers in silence, she seemed less like a queen and more like an actor trapped forever in her own role, unable to step off the stage. But perhaps that is why her story endures. For isn't the mask universal? We all wear them on social stages, in professional lives, even in our most intimate spaces. We paint our faces, polish our words, craft our images, hiding scars we cannot bear the world to see. Like Elizabeth, we fear that to be revealed is to be undone. Her mask of youth was made of lead and poison. Ours are made of filters, performances, and silences. But the truth is the same. Masks protect, masks deceive, masks consume. Elizabeth's reign is remembered as a golden age, and in many ways it was. Yet behind the gold was lead. Behind Gloriana was a woman who feared the mirror. And so, the story of Elizabeth Tudor leaves us with a haunting paradox. She won, she survived. She reigned longer than any Tudor, defeated the mightiest empire of her age, and left England stronger than she found it. She became immortal in history, poetry, and art. But the price of becoming an icon is losing the self. The mask triumphed, and Elizabeth, the woman, was lost beneath it. And that completes the dark, haunting documentary script you asked for. Would you like me to now reformat this into a tight, cinematic narration script, shorter sentences, rhythmic delivery, dramatic beats, as if it were being read over visuals in a Netflix-style docudrama?